It materialised almost without warning. Peter J. Hammond had authored one or two scripts for children's fantasy dramas, but most of his work up to this point had been in police procedurals and one-off kitchen sink plays. Similarly, producer-director Sean O'Riordan had a long CV of conventional sitcoms and one-off thrillers, but together they created one of the most original, memorable television fantasies ever produced in Britain. Was it science fiction or supernatural? That's one of the questions we face when we enter the world of Sapphire and Steel. Welcome to Very British Futures, the podcast about science fiction television produced in the United Kingdom. Today we're looking at a unique TV drama that has seared itself into the imaginations of many viewers who've watched it. Sapphire and Steel. Transuranics are not allowed, but amongst the medium atomic weights available are my guests, Simon Exton, co-host of the Exton Moss Experiment, and Mark Stalker, physics teacher and general concepts broker. There will be spoilers. Welcome to Very British Futures. How are you both tonight?
Very well, thank you. Very well. Nervous, but very excited at the same time.
And how about yourself, Simon?
Oh, I'm doing grand. Fairly fresh in from work, so full of beans and ready to go.
Sapphire and Steel ran for 34 25-minute episodes between 1979 and 1982. It was produced by ATV and starred David McCallum and Joanna Lumley. It was written by Peter J. Hammond, except for one 6-part story, which was by Don Horton and Anthony Reed. There are entities which exist outside of what we perceive as reality, and sometimes they break in to abduct people, to change human history for the worse, or for stranger motives. Sapphire and Steel are assigned to stop them. They look like a handsome couple, but quite what they are and who assigns them is a mystery. Sapphire is empathic, diplomatic, and sensitive to time disturbances. She can even freeze and rewind time for short periods. Steel is blunt, pragmatic, and exceptionally strong. Together they are a formidable team, but their antagonists are terrifyingly powerful. How did you first encounter the programme? And I will start with Mark, please.
Quite by accident, actually. In 1979, when the series was first being aired, I was sitting with my family in the living room one evening, and we were watching some other program, and a decision was made to change channels. And my sister Krisha is always the one who was sat closest to the television. Yeah, you can tell how old this is, because in the days before remote control, you had to physically get out the chair and go to the television set and push a button to change channels. So anyway, we changed channels, and the show was on, and it was partway through, and using bits of memory and Richard Callahan's excellent book on the unofficial guide to Sapphire and Steel, I recommend that. He gives air dates. So I've managed to kind of piece together what I think when this was. And it would have been, I believe, the penultimate episode of the railway story, partway through, Tuesday, the 20th of November, 1979. Like I say, it was partway through the episode. I didn't know what was going on, but I was intrigued. I recognised kind of David McCallum, because I think I remembered having seen him in The Great Escape or some such thing. And I recognised Joanna Lumley from the New Avengers, I think. And anyway, I just started watching the programs. I was intrigued by them. It was a very imaginative young boy. You're just watching all the events unfolding on the screen. Now, it wasn't until The next episode, which was on the Thursday, because we're always on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and it wouldn't have been until the Thursday, 2 days later, that I would have seen the opening and then the animated sequence of the elements coming into the screen. It was that experience when I saw the animation and saw all the other elements that really kind of sealed the deal for me, and for a very special reason, which I would like to share with you. I'll try and keep it as brief as I can. Only weeks before, my dad had taken up a position at Newcastle University as a lab technician in what was then the Department of Metallurgy. And it was probably during the half-term break, me and my sister went down to see Dad in his new place of work, and we were exploring the very spooky basement labs of King's Hall at Newcastle University. One of the labs, there was this old cabinet, a kind of desk cabinet with a glass top, and all these partitions within which were heaped all these metal samples. And it was aluminium, lead, copper, tin, zinc, and antimony. I'd heard of copper and lead before, but not the other elements. And this was my first introduction to the world of metals. And later on, I would find the world, my introduction to the world of the chemical elements. I never really paid much mind to the idea of metals before, so this was a whole new experience. And it would have been only weeks later this program came on, had all the elements flying into the screen. So for me, it was this kind of peculiar double encounter. I'd already had the kind of fascination with the chemical elements going on in my mind, and I see this program talking about the chemical elements and flying into the screen. So for a very imaginative young boy, this was a very unique experience for me. So, and it's lasted ever since, and Sapphire and Steel has been my all-time favorite television show, and I've never shut up about it since, basically.
Well, actually, before I get on to how I first came across Sapphire and Steel, I'm just going to add to Mark's story about Newcastle University, because I studied there in the chemistry department in the mid-1990s. So I know exactly where it is that you're talking about.
Oh, wow.
And I did a master's degree there, half in the School of Chemistry, half in the School of Clinical Biochemistry.
All the spooky interconnectivity there. Yes.
Absolutely. So I watched Sapphire and Steel right from episode 1, first transmission. It would have been a Tuesday. My sister and I were looked after by our grandparents on Tuesday evening, which meant that Nana and I could watch science fiction stuff because nobody else in the family liked it. Granddad wasn't interested in telly at all, so he used to disappear off and play chess with himself. And Nana and I used to watch whatever telly was on, but she found this new science fiction thing, and so we watched it right from the very start of the very first episode, and I watched every single episode of it afterwards. Now, I had to absolutely badger my folks to let me watch the Thursday episode because Nana wouldn't have been there then, and I must have just made such a pain of myself that I was allowed to watch it. And then that badgering, which to be honest rarely worked, and I think part of it was probably because my mum liked Joanna Lumley and liked her as an actress, so that was okay there. But it opened the door for me to be able to occasionally badger to watch other stuff. And the one I particularly remember was the Quatermass conclusion, and I begged and begged and begged to be able to watch that, and in the end they just gave up to shut me up. So Sapphire and Steel, I loved it at the time. It is one of the very few programs that I prefer watching to Doctor Who.
I must confess, Simon, I absolutely envy you, because it wasn't until the 90s when they released the VHS tapes that I saw for the very first time the first story, and then watched from the beginning through the railway story. Because like I said, it was very close. It was partway through the penultimate episode, the railway story. But I totally envy you having seen it from the very outset. That would have been amazing.
I've got memory. I know I did watch some of the original transmissions, but feeling my watching was very sporadic, and I've no idea why that was, because I was a very inside kid, and I didn't have any scouts or anything to go to, or after school activities. But for some reason, the Swift story rhymes. So I memorized that, and I think I saw a bit of the railway. I think probably the Adventure 5, the Agatha Christie, is probably the one I've saw the most at the time. I can also see possibly because it was an ITV show, we were a bit of a BBC house, so that could be why we didn't see it. So rather like you, Mark, I didn't see it properly really until the sort of late 80s and the tape trading days. It's a bit of an overused cliche to say a program there's nothing else like it, but I think in the case of Sapphire and Steel, I think it is a genuinely unique blend.
Yes, I absolutely.
And certainly at the time, because realistically, it's not science fiction, it's not horror, it's the very earliest television of genuine science fantasy.
It is, yeah. It is very like that. It kind of stands alone in many respects as being a kind of combination of sort of science fiction and sort of fantasy and sort of detective work. But its blend is very, very unique.
Mm. One of the things I find interesting about Sapphire and Steel is that it sort of breaks some sort of rules of writing, and one of them is about explaining itself. I mean, because there are plenty of television shows over history that have become infuriating because of their lack of explanation and sort of lack of internal logic over the years. And yet Sapphire and Steel, the more obscure and contradictory it gets over its sort of 4 or 5 years, actually the better, somehow the richer it seems.
Yes, yeah. I agree. Yeah.
And how do you feel about Simon?
Well, I was going to say, this is part of my reason why I classify it as science fantasy rather than science fiction, because science fiction, you need to give explanations. It's an intrinsic part of the genre. Horror, you don't need to. Not knowing, getting to the end, and there still being the thing that's out there, or things that are unknowable, too weird to comprehend. That's an intrinsic part of the horror genre. Mm-hmm. And science fantasy is kind of halfway between the two. And don't get me wrong, there are some horrific bits in Sapphire and Steel, but keeping in context. And there are some very fantastical bits in it. Very little in the way of decent science, to be honest, even down to the fact that they describe themselves as elements, and neither Sapphire nor Steel is actually an element.
I was going to say, I do have a little bit of a theory about Sapphire and Steel in terms of its creation by P.J. Hammond that kind of explains why Sapphire and Steel themselves weren't really explained. I think from the outset, the focus was so much on the stories and the events, the enemy breaking through, and then Sapphire and Steel dealing with the problem and the interaction with the characters and all of that. I think it was probably by chance, not by design initially, that the story's focus was on the dramatic effects of these things breaking in on Earth and Sapphire and Steel dealing with them. They just turned up to deal with it, so it was never needed to explain because it wasn't a focus priority to explain who they were. I think when the program got started, I think it was probably then a choice. Let's steer away from not giving any kind of explanations there were, because it does create drama and atmosphere, them being shrouded in mystery. So I think, from the beginning, it was probably just a case of, let's focus on the stories. Let's not we don't need to. They just turn up, and then somebody asks the question, well, where did they come from? Oh, well, I don't know. I mean, P.J. Hammond has himself said in interviews, he's been asked this many times, and he doesn't know who they are, which is really, really, really quite fascinating.
So you get that in a lot of P.J. Hammond's more fantastical writing. Now, for most of his career, he was police procedural, and he was things like Z-Cars. But there would be the occasional foray into something more fantastical. So before this, he'd done I think, 4 of the Ace of Wands stories, and I think he wrote about half of the final season. So there are 3 of his stories that still survived, which are The Meddlers, The Beautiful People, and Peacock Pie. So Peacock Pie and The Beautiful People, you never really get an explanation of what's going on. Peacock, have either of you guys seen Ace of Wands?
I know of it, and I know that PJ Hammond was, because he's talked about this in his kind of bits of memoirs over the years, that he was involved in Ace of Wands. I have never, to my shame, I have never seen any of the show, and I really, as part of my kind of education in the fantasy and science fiction, I really ought to.
And the Peacock Pie episode has Brian Wilde as this very lonely man who has psychic powers and doesn't really knows how to do what he can do, but doesn't really know how to interact with people to be able to get anything out of them. So it's all about sort of forcing people to do what he thinks they should do, so that he can find friends. There's no explanation of how he got these powers, and at the end of it, there's no particularly big conclusion. He just realizes that he's not meant to be around people and wanders off. And it's all very gentle and it's very fantastical, and it does have a feel of Sapphire and Steel about it, because nothing is explained. Things are resolved, but there's no real explanation in that resolution.
Peacock Pie is the one episode. I have seen that one of Ace of Wands. Like Mark, and after listening to your podcast on, I know Exton Moss has covered Ace of Wands.
We've done them as individual stories. So Peacock Pie is one of the ones that we've done, and we've done a couple of the other surviving stories, because we're fortunate that the entire 3rd season survives, and that's 3 out of the 4 stories that PJ Hammond wrote.
Okay, I have seen his script he wrote for Shadows, the children's anthology series.
Oh, it's marvelous, isn't it?
It is, and again, it does have a bit of the feel of a Sapphire and Steel episode about it. But this rather sad, small-time magician who discovers he can do an actual magic trick, which is making things disappear. And he actually gets these magic powers. Again, unexplained. It just sort of happens. Yeah, comes a cropper. I won't give away what happens to him, but again, it has you could see that being the basis of our Sapphire and Steel sort of story.
Yeah, and he wrote a couple of Torchwoods as well, which again had that whole fantastical element. One around fairies, one around circus folk.
I mean, by that time, his reputation. He's the Sapphire and Steel guy, so that's kind of why they go to him. PJ Hammond didn't have a definitive answer over the years. I was wondering if either of you have had, in your own personal headcanons, is it something you've wondered about who or what Sapphire and Steel are?
I have very definite opinions and conceptual speculations about who they are. What makes sense to me, because I mean, these concepts are very, very high and very, very obscure. I guess the problem is, how do you relate kind of chemical elements in one respect with living kind of beings with certain kind of powers and characteristics that kind of, in a bizarre kind of way, reflect the sort of chemical, nuclear and bulk properties of their material analogues? The steel is a bit kind of dull and hard boiled, sort of kind of characteristics of kind of steel in a way. My personal concept is this, that they hark back to a much older universe. What we would call the Big Bang represents the start of the creation of material on our universe, but not the universe itself. I think that what you have is a much, much more ancient universe where you've got patterns of information that exist. Even back then, the universe is being bombarded and invaded in a bit way, in a pathogenic kind of way by these entities, from ancient times. And, the universe develops an immune system, and the immune system follows certain patterns. And then those patterns become more sophisticated and then sentient. And what happens is, at some point, the universe turns into a material universe, and the same kind of patterns that existed in that old universe somehow get carried down and form the basis of the creation of the chemical elements in terms of just patterns of information. But also you get Sapphire and Steel coming forth as being an embodied representation of the entities that existed that were part of the immune system of the old universe. So I know that sounds really bonkers, but what it means is that both the elemental agents and the material analogues are both successors to a common predecessor in a more ancient universe. That's my theory. What about yours, Simon?
Actually, remarkably similar. You've approached this from the perspective of a physicist. I've approached this from the perspective of a medic. I think they're antibodies.
Yeah.
I think they are the reaction of the universe to an invading antigen. And on a sort of space-time level, the thing that breaks through is time as an invading antigen, and the elements or the elementals are an antibody response to that. So we're actually coming out with exactly the same concept. I mean, I don't have the pre-universe bit. You from the point of view of a physicist and me from the point of view of a medic.
I think that they are both fascinating theories. I'm kind of thinking along similar lines, but what is interesting about Sapphire and Steel is that you're both talking about these universal forces coming down. And you'd think such forces would be quite angel-like or godlike. They'd be sort of quite ethereal. Then definitely not. I think that's one of the genius things, that they are both Sapphire and Steel have got. Then they're definitely not human, but they have very human personalities. Interestingly, there's one of them. I think it's Adventure 4 with the photographs, where Steel sort of complains about the specialists sitting around letting us do all the work, or sort of lines, which suddenly makes it sound like they're coming from somewhere very bureaucratic and sort of like office politics are going on, which is very different to any kind of sort of ethereal super being. So I find that
it's like the cosmic FBI. I mean, they're kind of like G-Man and G-Woman, aren't they? In a way. I mean, certainly Steel kind of comes across like that as being kind of a very hard-nosed kind of cosmic FBI agent ready to come in, and the feds have come in, as it were. The feds of space-time have come in, as it were. And I mean, the way Steel behaves, he does behave very much like some, suited up, shirt and tie job, authoritarian type, having to cross all the T's, dot all the I's, that kind of thing. So he does look kind of almost like an office worker, as well as being this kind of space-time detective.
And again, I have a bit of a theory about that, because in that story they make a thing about how there are operators and there are specialists, and the two operators that we see are Sapphire and Steel. And specialist that we see is Silver. I'm not really sure quite how lead fits into this, although he kind of does a slightly different specialist role. And my theory is that you've got the true elements. So silver is a metallic element, lead is a metallic element, and they are the specialists. They're the specialists. And then if you take some of the skills from one particular element and blend it with skills from another element and blend it with skills from another element, then you end up with a sort of amalgam of elements, which are your operators. And that's where you have Sapphire and Steel neither being pure elements, because they bring along some of the skills of the more specialist one skill. And this kind of fits in with later in that story where they're trying to make a mirror. And they're saying to each other, think about what Silver can do, think about what Mercury can do, and they bring that skill forward and turn it into a mirror.
Yes, they borrow, because Steel says borrow from their minds. It's almost like they're kind of tapping into that kind of skill set, and therefore they're able to create the mirror because they tap into both Mercury's and Silver's kind of technical abilities. It's interesting. I tell you what's also interesting for me is that in the final ever story, story 6, very, very briefly, as always the case with these extra little bits of information, which are kind of just very subtly tied in with other bits of dialogue. They're having a chat with Silver, and Sapphire says, specialists are never called in until operators and investigators have done their work. Now, in another interview, I have heard Hammond talk about this. Investigators, that third group with the operators, together with operators and specialists. This might interest you, Simon, but I imagine the Nobel gases to be kind of investigatory kind of people. Hammond has suggested that prior to the operators being sent in, a kind of reconnaissance team is sent in when a disturbance or an irregularity is detected. A kind of a team is sent in to gather some initial information, from which they then create a brief, and then issue the assignments to whoever's available, and that's when they sit down, have the brief with the agents before sending them in to deal with the problem. And I rather like that, and I always think that would have made a very interesting story in itself, as maybe exploring some of the elements that might be the reconnaissance team, just going in, sniffing around, trying to gather some information, walking around, some obscure building like an old library or something like that, just trying to gather information as to what's going on and then reporting back. I always found that a very fascinating idea. But Hammond has said he imagines himself that there's some kind of reconnaissance team is sent in initially to kind of find out some, initial information.
And you're right, the noble gases would work perfectly from that, because they're impervious and they're able to, as gaseous, they're able to go anywhere and wouldn't be affected by anything, but equally can't interact with anything. So yeah, they would make ideal scouts.
Yeah. Interesting.
I like that.
I like the way you put that, Sam. I never thought about that myself.
That's all. Neatly come together. We've touched a little bit on sort of like the personalities. Steele's sort of pragmatism and coldness, and Sapphire's more sort of flirty and empathic, sensitive, more personality. But some of the most memorable moments are, in a way, when they go to the other end of the spectrum, both of them. So it's always quite shocking when it's Sapphire who does something quite ruthless or suddenly gets very tough. And similarly, when Steele sort of like becomes vulnerable in some stories. What do you think about their personalities and the performances of those actors?
The performances, that's an incredibly easy question to answer, because they are just superb. Two brilliant actors, top of their game. There are whole sequences where there's realistically no moving visuals, and it's just voice acting. Even at that point in time, you couldn't possibly imagine that now, but even at that point in television was really unusual. And it's particularly the Dr. McD Must Die episode, where you get elements like this, where they're there just looking at each other, surrounded by people, and you can hear the conversation that's going on, and neither of them are saying anything. And then there's the bit where Sapphire goes spectrally goes through the door and gets trapped behind, and all of that performance is her vocals. The bit where they're turned into photos and they're in that picture frame, and you can get the desperation of them trying to get out of the frame, and the man without the face coming towards them, and knowing that they're going to have the same fate of being burnt alive in the picture, which is horrible, an absolutely horrible concept. But the whole of that performance is put across using just vocals, and that really brings home just how brilliant and skilled they are. And it reminds me in a way of, I don't know if either of you know Marvel Comics.
I know some Marvel Comics.
Right. The Canadian team, which is Alpha Flight, which is my favorite of all of the Marvel titles, created by a guy called Johnny Byrne. One of the very earliest issues has almost no pictures. It's an issue called Snowblind, and all of the panels are just blank white because it's the story of one of the characters trapped in a snowstorm. So all you get are the speech bubbles. But because of the way they're arranged, and because of the shape of the panels, you get an impression of the story that's going along. It's very much like that. You have to have massive skill to be able to sell something like that. So to sell a comic book without pictures, to sell a TV program without moving images, that takes a huge amount of skill, both on the part of the writer, but also on the part of the actors. I think they are incredible performances.
The performances are most definitely part of the reason why that original series works so well. It's without question. It's not just the performances. There's also that kind of quality of what I've talked to other people about over the years, about screen presence. And I remember seeing a bit of a documentary with Sean O'Reilly talking about, in the early stages when they were going through the casting and, going through the ideas and preparing things for the show. And one person on the team says to Sean O'Reilly, "You want to get someone, with some heft like David McCallum." And Sean O'Reilly said the funny thing was, he says the person who he was answerable to says, "Love the show, think it's great, and I'll give you this additional budget of 5,000." And then they get David McCallum on board, and he's phased 5,000. And this is what Sean O'Reilly says. He says, "So, that's the budget shot to hell." It says by getting him on board. And then the discussion thereafter was says, "Well, if you're going to get someone like, McCallum on board to do this thing, you're going to have to kind of pair him up with someone really kind of charismatic." And, so you get the lovely Joanna Lumley on board. And together they just make a fantastic pair. They really do. It's not just the fact that their performances are so strong. It's that they're very, very memorable. They've got great screen presence, and they had fantastic chemistry together. And that is one of the, the key elements, no pun intended, of the original series, in my opinion. As to the idea of, which one's the more ruthless, this is unusual, and I have given this consideration because there are times where their roles seem to flip a bit, and Sapphire seems to be quite icy in the penthouse suite where they're having to send the capsule back into the future. And Steel says, "Well, we can't just send this kind of bizarre kind of creature that is a genetic blend of all animals on Earth that's acquired all of this temporal power. We can't just send it back with them." And she says very icily, very coldly, "It's they brought it with them. It's their problem. They have to deal with it. It doesn't belong here. In the 20th century, they're going to have to deal with it." And she's very, very, let them suffer it.
I mean, we've eased into it, I feel. Normally, with a longer running series, I ask people to pick a favourite episode to talk about. It's a bit more difficult with Sapphire and Steel because there's not that much of it. And I think it is, to my mind, this is my opinion, I think it's an amazingly consistent series as well. It doesn't have big highs and lows. It's all pretty consistently good. So, but I was wondering if there's sort of like particular moments or sequences that sum up to you why we all like this series so much.
This has been a nightmare for me because I have prepared notes and I have listed. Now, you talk about this being a short television series, which it was. But it's a bit like an espresso. It might be a small drink, but it's a very, very intense one. And when it comes to the memorable moments, there are so many moments, so many scenes, and so many quotes that I love.
The thing in my head that absolutely sums up why I love Sapphire and Steel, and it's one particular scene, and it's in the fifth story. And while they're working out what's going on, and it's Sapphire and Steel just together with their glasses of champagne in the library. And it's that whole looking visually amazing, superb performances, just looking effortlessly classy, but with really interesting, weird stuff going on as well. That kind of sums up why I love Sapphire and Steel.
Well, God, yeah, right. I think what really set off the program very well is where they go to do kind of an experiment in Helen's room in the very first story, and they're going to replicate the conditions that brought about the time breakthrough. And Steele is almost kind of, in a very almost laboratory kind of sequenced kind of way, talking to Sapphire, we're going to do it this way. You're going to read this out. If I say back, reverse the order of the words. And that whole sequence gradually, and it builds and builds, and it's amazing. She just reads in a very plain, matter-of-fact kind of way, the rhyme, ring a roses, a pocket full of posies, a tissue. And then you hear the kind of clocks increasing in intensity. And then the next thing, when she reads a bit, and all of a sudden you hear the clock stop. And you just, the camera, the editing just goes around the room and you see the clock's dead. And then she starts reading, the bird upon the steeple and on the door in an echoed kind of a way sits high above the people. And then there's this kind of almost breeze that comes into the room that's blowing around. And the whole scene just mounts and mounts and mounts. And progressively, as Sapphire reads through more of the rhyme, the wall gives way, time gets distended. You see this creature from, this kind of, human from some other time walking along the corridor, as it were. And all these images of other people who presumably have got trapped in time, all kind of tied in throughout the centuries, but tied into the same kind of event where time breaks through. It's almost like simultaneously breaking in at different points and capturing these various people. You see this woman carrying a candle, she screams and disappears. And that whole sequence, I think, is brilliant because it's very, very early on in the very, very first episode. And it just sets the tone of the whole kind of Sapphire and Steel atmosphere, that, that the reading of a nursery rhyme, almost like some kind of bizarre scientific formula in the right temporal contextual conditions, kicks off this whole collapse.
I'll just respond slightly to Mark's last comment, because the people that we saw, I didn't think were people who got trapped in time. I thought they were personifications taken from the text of the nursery rhymes. So Ring a Roses being about plague, and you saw a plague victim.
Right. Ooh. Okay. Of course. Yes.
And then when you get the Cavaliers and you get the woman who reacts to them, I thought that they were coming from that goosey gander, and it was all about the Roundheads and Cavaliers. My take was that all of those figures were like their personifications that are sort of brought out of almost as the sort of the antigens to Sapphire and Steel's antibodies.
Interesting.
Would you like to name another
absolutely.
moment?
And mine, again, is a very sort of stylized visual image. And it's almost one of the last images that we see. The very final story and in the final scene. And Sapphire and Steel are there in the garage. And the male and female transient beings come in. And they're all dolled up in their 1940s gear. And the woman who was pretending to have no confidence and needing to be looked after was suddenly standing up straight and tall and had the perfect makeup, and they sit down together, and she says this is a trap and it's forever, and she just gently lays her head on D'Souza's shoulder, and that it makes such a beautiful image. And her performance in that reminded me of Jane Birkin, wasn't it? It was Jane Birkin and Nicholas Clay at the end of Evil Under the Sun, where she's been this very mousy, sort of subservient wife, until it's pointed out that was her whole persona that she played to get through the murder. And then it comes to the end, and she's there in this dramatic black and white striped suit with a perfectly done hair and perfectly done makeup. And that image of the two incredibly powerful beings just being laid back and we've won, we don't need to care about this. And that visual image of her with her head on his shoulder, just absolutely outstanding.
Yes, a memorable moment. Mark, would you like to unveil a second?
Yeah, just very briefly. It is an amazing moment. My personal take is that she all along is not just very strong and confident. I think she's the commander of the the kind of like negative assignment to get rid of Sapphire and Steel. I think she's the one in command. That's my impression from that.
Yeah.
And it is, that scene is one where they're trapped forever, and it's one of the most chilling and unsettling scenes I have ever seen in a show. I mean, it was so dismal an ending. It was, I don't know how to encapsulate it really. But anyway, moving on to one of my another one of my personal best scenes. I've mentioned that Sapphire and Steel is my all-time favorite television show. My all-time favorite moment is on the staircase in the photographs where they're in the house. Sapphire detects something has been on the stairs, and of course, it's the photograph of an entity has been standing there some minutes before, and she picks up on a few details, and there's all this kind of interesting conversation about the nature of this thing, and she can't quite get a grasp on it. Anyway, Steele does a bit of walking around and says, when was he on that stair? It's all about 7 minutes ago, and they decide to take time backwards. Sapphire does her prep for this particular section of the stairs, and she starts to take time backwards, and then Sapphire gets this horrible chill as if something's going wrong, and Steele says, well, if it won't come back, and she says it has to come back in one form or another, it has to come back. And she goes up the stairs and she's looking there and she focuses all her attention, and then you just get this amazing use of special effects, which Sapphire and Steel always underplayed, which I thought was very important. You get this kind of smudging effect of the atmosphere and this horrible echoey voice of the photographic entity reprising what he had said to Liz's character when they were talking on the stairs. It's almost as if the photographic entity is exploiting and repurposing its own conversation with somebody else to address Sapphire, and almost kind of like a challenging kind of a way, because she's saying, show us who you are, and but you've seen my face, why should I hide? Why should I hide? It's almost like the entity's coming back in time, but he's kind of manipulating his own kind of coming back in time. In the background, you hear this horrible, distorted kind of screaming of a female voice, and I'm assuming that it is the Ruth Phillips character who's trapped in a photograph, somehow by Sapphire tapping into to the shapes, the photographic entity. By tapping in, she's kind of releasing some of the disturbance that the shape is bringing about the entrapment of this character Ruth Phillips, and you just get this horrible distorted screaming and this blurring on the staircase. I absolutely am just entranced by this particular woman. Like I say, it's my favorite overall scene within the entire series.
Certainly conveyed it there. Simon, would you like one last choice of a scene?
And again, I would like. I have to say, Mark, you have picked an amazing scene there, and a part of it that I absolutely love is that once Sapphire has done all this summoning and forcing the thing to come back, she then scuttles up the stairs and crouches down and looks through the banisters, and that's just a beautiful, beautiful touch from Joanna Lumley. My final take is again going to be from this story, because this is by far my favorite story. I think it is just beautifully structured and beautifully holds together. And it's the scene where the photograph gets burnt, because that is just horrific and beautifully played. Again, very powerful audio performance. Coming back to the Ruth character, and the bit where a little bit later on, where Liz comes back saying, "Could I have the picture that you had of Ruth?" And it's gone, and she's not in the picture anymore because she has gone. But the concept of trapping somebody in a photo and then burning the photo and be able to hear them screaming as they're burnt alive, that was phenomenal.
I'm glad you mentioned it. That's one that stayed with me, the utter horribleness of it. And especially, and it's amazing, you're talking about vocal performances, because we've never met Ruth, really. We've only heard her voice a little bit, and it still feels absolutely tragic she dies in that way.
Yeah. And the bit where you see she's there in the photo in the window, and as you hear her burning, you just see her fading from that photo, and then it's gone, and she's gone.
Mark, would you like any comments on that one?
That one again is on my list. I mean, because it's brilliant. And if I might just add something to it, the whole lead up to the burning scene where Sapphire is holding conference with Ruth by talking to the photograph. I mean, it's bonkers, but again, the atmosphere is just off the charts. And again, you don't need special effects. What you can achieve by way of sound, the studio bound voice of Ruth from somewhere else as she's talking to kind of, Sapphire, echoing, from the photographic universe, as it were. That whole lead up towards the burning is, equally amazing.
And her performance is groggy, as though she's just been woken up or summoned from somewhere, and as though she was sort of trapped in this 2-dimensional world where she couldn't fully integrate and couldn't work out what was going on.
And she does say, she says, because I've been thinking a lot about stuff recently. It's a bit like I had an operation as a kid. It's a bit like that. Like kind of like under anesthetic in an operation, kind of neither here nor somewhere. It's absolutely amazing.
I'd like to touch a little bit on the production side of this. That's part of the appeal of Sapphire and Steel, that they do a lot with not a lot. I thought if you'd agree with me there.
Absolutely.
And it's a case that they make a virtue out of their pretty much studio-bound sort of production.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's like the ghost children from the photograph is all done with sepia makeup and one cardboard cutout, then crumbles. And the umbrellas coming alive, it's a very cheaply done effect, but it's brilliant. And then freeze framing and switching to black and white for the conversion into the photograph scenes. And what on any other show would look like an incredibly cheap Quantel effect works brilliantly. In this, it's kind of like the antithesis of a lot of more modern science fiction, in that it's plot-driven, it's character-driven, it is performance-driven, with the special effect adding on from the outside. It's not, we've got this monumental space battle sequence, and we'll throw some human interest stuff around the outside. It's character and it's plot front and centre.
In fact, you actually begin to sort into my final question, which is: do you think it could be revived? Do you think there's a place you could make it work in today's TV? You're shaking your head, Mark. Yeah.
No. Sorry. If you'd asked me this question back in the early 90s when they had released it on VHS, being a naive person of those years, just my early 20s, and given the fact that, oh my god, I remember that show, it's fun, they're going to bring it back, that's fantastic. In fact, I did read an article at the time where it was being touted as being brought back. If you'd asked me then, I would say, oh, that'd be wonderful, that'd be fantastic. Knowing now what I know of kind of production, and particularly modern day production, I would say there are so many ways in which you could get this wrong. Sapphire and Steel was massively dependent upon the conditions and the time period in which it worked. Its limited budget forced it to make, as you've pointed out, Gareth, have to make resourceful, clever, inventive ways of capturing ideas other than using special effects. Use of sound was very, very well done in Sapphire and Steel. This use of the music was really very brilliant. But clever things like what Simon was talking about, where you see Ruth Phillips in the photograph. There's no special effects there. They're just talking to a photograph and you hear her voice. There's no special effects there. It's just, you just piece together a few things that couldn't happen. And all of a sudden you create this magical, amazing kind of production effect. Now, where would you get... I know what a modern day production kind of team would think. They would go in, we've got lots of money, big budget, special effects, go in there, and it would just become just this big kind of overblown thing. I don't even think they would get. I'm not even convinced really by modern day story writers, if I'm honest. And the thing is this: Sapphire and Steel stories. PJ Hammond just had this thing where he kind of knew his own thing. He got it right, and it required very, very careful interpretation of the, because yes, time breaks in, but how does it break in? In the very first story, it is quite literally, he talks about time breaking in. So the temporal entities that break in because the fabric is weak. So they break in a very explicit kind of a way. With the other stories, the entities breaking in, it finds some kind of foothold, some mechanism by which it can get in, like with the soldiers, kind of misery and bitterness and resentment gathering over the years. It kind of breaks in that way. With the photographs, it breaks in that way. And the thing is this knowledge and kind of there's almost some kind of a pseudoscience that PJ Hammond understood, to arrive at these stories. And I don't think modern day writers would go back and look at the conditions under which the story evolved originally. I don't think they would, acknowledge or try to understand the production techniques that we use to achieve the stories. I don't think they would, bother about how the original stories were, like I've just described, how you come up with the stories, how you think about these entities in this kind of way. I think they would just go in for just some very quick, stack them high, sell them cheap kind of quick stories. And for me, it would be a case of what you would end up with is a show that would be in Sapphire and Steel in name only.
My answer has always been very similar, and I've always said no to this question. Over the last few years, I've amended that in that, Mark, I agree with every single thing that you've said. And if there was an attempt at doing a big budget remake, I think it would completely fail. However, I think as a concept, it has potential, but you couldn't do Sapphire and Steel. You could not do Sapphire and Steel without Lumley and McCallum. That wouldn't work. It would always be seen as a pale imitation, no matter who you got in. So it would have to become, I don't know, Copper and Ruby or something like that. It would have to be other focus characters. And the thing that you would really need to have, the thing that the only way it could possibly work is to have a writer of the caliber and imagination of PJ Hammond. And I think that there are people that could do it. And the name that is at the top of my list for that is China Miéville. I don't know if you've seen The City in the City, and the concept behind that. And that's two cities that are side by side but overlap, and you can't see from one city to the other, but it's never clear whether this is a cultural thing. So kids are raised to ignore part of the other city, and you're taught to recognize which bits of dress and architecture and everything point towards the other city, and you ignore that, or whether there's actually some sort of weird metaphysical overlap. And at no point is that explained or made clear, or does it need to be? And I think he has the kind of imagination, and the books that he's written, so things like Perdido Street Station and The Iron Council, and my personal favorite of all of them is Kraken, which I think is just brilliant. But he has that kind of perceptual imagination for the weird behind the ordinary. And I think you would need something like that. I think you would need to have a smaller budget so the ideas could take center stage. And so you didn't have the people who were paying the bills calling the shots. So I think it's possible, but I don't think it would happen, because I think Sapphire and Steel as a name just has this almost mythic quality of its own. So I have a question for you. If it were to come back and you had a male and female protagonist, who do you think has the gravitas to be able to pull that off?
Well, I'll let you into a bit of background, because me and a friend of mine back in the 90s we actually wrote to PJ Hammond. We did get a response from him. But I'll put that to one side. I don't want to talk about this. It's the wrong time to talk about, but I put forward the idea of diamond and jade, and I pictured diamond because you would automatically think of a gemstone as being naturally feminine and female, and I didn't. And I thought, oh, someone, a male who's hard and cold and sharp, to play diamond. And at the time, I couldn't think of who would play him. I know who I would get now to play diamond, and it would be Benedict Cumberbatch. But I don't know who would play the part of Jade. But that's what I would consider as kind of a winning formula. You would really have to pick people who are really kind of like really sharp actors who could who could really embody those kind of like elemental characteristics. Like I say, the interpretation of diamond is even harder and colder than steel is, if that's possible. Because I mean, diamond is, in terms of material character, it's a material analog, is hard, cold, and brilliant. So you want someone almost like a mathematical mind, sharp, really sharp and icy. I think Benedict would fantastically kind of play a role like that. As to who would play Jade, I don't know. But that would be my kind of, way. By the way, have I gone off beam here? Is this actually answering the question you asked, Simon?
No, you're answering exactly the question that I asked. And it's given me time to think about my answer because I've never actually thought of that question prior to asking it. What I think I would do, bringing it back, is swap the archetypes. So have the steel role played by the female protagonist and have the more empathetic sapphire role played by the male protagonist. And I think the person who would do a brilliant job of that is Ben Whishaw.
Okay, I need to look into that, yeah.
And the hard as diamond female character, Helen Mirren, with the age difference, have it as a mentor-mentee relationship. So she's somebody who is coming to the end of her time as Diamond, and he's somebody who is just starting in with his role as Gold or whatever. As it goes forward, you could have her being replaced by a younger version that he then trains.
Oh, it's like a Jedi kind of Padawan kind of relationship. In a way, it's a
sort of zigzag thing.
Yeah, it's a zigzag kind of thing. Yeah,
that's very interesting. I like the way, and I like the way it puts a bit of space between this revival and the original one, which I agree you would need. You couldn't just have Sapphire and Steel. It would have to be something from the world of Sapphire and Steel.
So things like that, but they're all ones that are sort of off on the schedules. They're not front and center on BBC One. They've not got a million different executive producers, each wanting to blandify it into something that they can be certain will be a hit. You need to take a risk. You need to say, we can't be certain that this will work, but won't it be interesting to try?
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned producers, because I was going to say we've been talking quite a bit about PJ Hammond. I think it's worth we were very lucky that he got partnered with Sean O'Regan. I hope I pronounced that right. Gave him the perfect support, really, to realise those stories.
Yeah, I think they were definitely a good creative pair. May I just quickly ask Simon a quick question? I'll keep it
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, fire off.
Simon, so I have for myself created my own elemental avatar who's my alter ego. Do you have an elemental avatar from the periodic table or beyond the periodic table of your own, someone who would be your kind of elemental soulmate, do you think?
Oh, God, no, I don't have anywhere near that much ego. Sorry, that was a horribly rude thing to say. But if I was to pick an element of the periodic table, and I would obviously have to pick a character to go alongside it, I'm not going to pick one of the standard metals. They're not interesting enough. So I'm going to want something P block, somewhere around the middle.
How about iodine, the medic?
No.
All right.
I haven't got an idea, I must admit. That is a very unique
gallium.
Yeah, and I know I've just picked a transition metal, but
no, gallium is P block.
Oh God, and I've got a degree in chemistry. They need to take that away from me now. But yes, you're right. Right, it is, and it
expands when it cools,
and it has
a low melting point.
Yeah, it's the one where it's the one that you can make a spoon of and it will dissolve in a cup of tea. And I quite like that kind of, it's not quite what you think. Almost a sort of sleight of the hand eccentricity.
Very good.
I'll go with gallium.
Gallium, excellent.
But if you ask me that question again tomorrow, I'll probably come up with a different answer.
And how about yourself, Mark?
Lanthanum. And it's because the ancient Greek word for lanthanum is lanthanine, which means to lie unseen. So I imagine this element has the capability of kind of submerging himself into space and time at a lower level, to detect what's kind of going on. So he has very special characteristics. So he's a technical element, a specialist, but a specialist with very unusual abilities. So Lanthanum is my kind of alter ego kind of character. It would be very interesting to explore as an idea, the character of Lanthanum, I believe.
Lanthanum fluoride was the original anti-glare coat on lenses, wasn't it?
Oh, I don't know. I'll need to look that up. It might have been.
It was certainly one of the rare earth fluorides, and I thought it was lanthanum.
It may be. I need to look that up. Yeah.
Protective. On that bombshell.
Well, I was going to say that there's one thing that we haven't discussed, because we talked about the show coming back and not mentioned the fact that the show did come back with Big Finish. And did either of you listen to those and have thoughts about them?
I'll answer this one first. Actually, I listened to the first season. Nothing wrong with the casting of David Warner and Susanna Harker. I think they're both fine actors. But weird, I found it quickly became a bit formulaic after the first story. It felt like everyone's a big fan of Adventure 2, and there was a kind of Adventure 2-ness about a lot of those stories, and far too much spooky children as well. It's got to be leading somewhere. All these spooky children appearing in every story, and then it didn't lead to anything. So I thought they were reasonably well made, but no, I in the end I remained a bit ungripped, and I haven't bothered with seasons 2 and 3. Mark, have you heard any of these?
Yes, I did. I didn't hear all of them. I bought a few of them when they first came out. The one story I felt was really quite effective. I think it might have been the second or the third story, where the lad comes back from university and he's got his younger sister there, and his younger sister is the twin who survived, and the other twin died in childbirth, I believe. But the mother keeps the ashes of the other twin in the house, and the ashes somehow retain something of a person that time exploits and breaks in that way, via the kind of, because one twin survived and the other one didn't, so this other twin is kind of resentful of life, and time managed to exploit that, and it breaks in that way. I thought that was an interesting one, and I didn't think that the story panned out quite as well as it might have done as a story, but I certainly felt it was quite powerful. And the scene at the end, which is quite grim, where the only way in which they can resolve the situation is very, very, very dark, actually. They persuade the twin sister to commit suicide, and she does. She sadly cuts her wrists, but when she dies, the other twin dies with her, and time is locked out, and that's how they resolve. And then Sapphire and Steel make a quick getaway out of the house, and then the mother finds the dead daughter in the living room. Very, very dark, very, very unsettling, but I thought it was in the kind of, in the spirit of, Sapphire and Steel. Like, it's a case of not everything nicely gets resolved, because the bigger picture is really keeping time out of, time from breaking in, and getting rid of, the entity is what matters. But, there is kind of really bad collateral damage at times, and that story kind of touched upon that.
How about yourself, Simon? How do you feel about the Big Finish?
Again, I've listened to the first season and a couple of others. I wasn't particularly impressed. I didn't think it was well written. I thought it was, as with almost everything in Big Finish, very well acted and very well produced. I just didn't think the scripts were there, and it was very much a Sapphire and Steel by numbers, with nothing particularly innovative going into it, with the exception of one in a lighthouse that didn't come across as a Sapphire and Steel story at all, came much more across as an Alan Garner story. So things like Redshift and the Owl Service and that kind of feel to it. And I'm in Stoke-on-Trent. I'm right in the heart of Alan Alan Garner territory. I live only a few miles away from Mount Cop, so a lot of the things that he wrote about are around this area. I mean, his works are brilliant, and that lighthouse story struck me as much more an Alan Garner style, and it was the only one of the first series that I found to have any originality to it at all. I wasn't really a fan of The Big Finish, but it's not really fair to discuss Sapphire and Steel without discussing that. And again, nothing wrong with the performance from either of the leads, but you can't help with a character called Sapphire and a character called Steel comparing to Joanna Lumley and David McCallum. And a recreation of those roles is always going to fail by comparison.
The Lighthouse one is quite a strong one into, like I say, as a story. I'd like to cover Red Shift. It's just a bit too much fantasy to really fit into this podcast, unfortunately. It's sort of one
Alan
of those...
Alan Garner is brilliant, by the way. I have Red Shift and the Hour Service, so yes, thumbs up to him. He is amazing. Yes, I just thought I'd make that point since it was mentioned.
Yeah, and the TV adaptations of both are incredible.
Well, I haven't watched them, but I think I've got them on disc. And there's so much backlog I need to get through.
The Owl Service is one that you have to luxuriate in. It is slow, but it's atmospherically slow. It builds up around you. I mean, that is one that you can just sit down and watch. I know it's 8 hours, but you can just sit down and watch, and it builds and builds and builds and builds. And the three leads are phenomenal.
Well, I think it only remains for me to talk a little bit before we sign off to both of you about other things going on in your life. Let's start with Mark. What sort of projects, work are you embarking on at the moment?
Apart from teaching maths and physics. The funny thing is, I'm a bit of a bizarre kind of an individual because I'm a child from two worlds, as it were. I have a very logical kind of mathematical and physics mind, and a very kind of deep sense of what is kind of real. But similarly, on the other side of my character, I'm kind of very mysterious and spooky. I mean, I grew up with Arthur C. Clarke, his mysterious world and later the world of strange powers. I've always had a fascination for ghosts. I do believe in the existence of ghosts, not in a spirit kind of a way, but as a phenomenon. I have my own theories about that. What I find very curious about myself is the fact that I can deal with concepts in a raw kind of way, so that I can utilize the same kind of conceptual framework building capacity to think about physics and mathematical ideas as I can for kind of like story ideas and the concepts that we talked about in Sapphire and Steel. Peculiar fluid boundary between two extremes, as it were. But one of the things I'm kind of doing at the moment in my life is making a study of AI, looking at the science to that. The interesting thing about AI, because it's looking at how artificial intelligence needs to kind of review what natural intelligence is, which we still don't know. We don't have a conclusive idea on the nature of consciousness itself. When you get into AI, it starts to open so many doors into so many areas of physics, mathematics, information theory. At the moment, I am just absolutely soaking up as much as I can about all of this kind of conceptual stuff. I'm presently looking into complexity theory, which is a fascinating area of science. So there's a lot going on with me at the moment, but again, it's all big concepts, big ideas, bizarre kind of stuff. It's in a mathematical way, but it's still kind of out there in some way. So yes, that's me.
Well, it sounds exciting, and I can see why Sapphire and Steel, which blends so much, is so appealing. And Simon, what's coming up?
I was just going to say, Mark, that sounds like the perfect CV for a science fiction writer, because you've got the greats like Asimov, who had a really good grounding in physical science. He was a biochemist, wasn't he? Arthur C. Clarke was an engineer. So you need to start writing stuff.
Yes, I need to get.
I would definitely read it.
Yes, definitely. Yes. Get finger to keyboard. Definitely. Yes. And Simon, what's coming up with the Exton Moss experiment and your other podcasts?
Exton Moss is plodding along. We've got a couple of collaborations coming up with the Peggy Mount Calamity Hour, who we spend quite a bit of time collaborating with, to put it as it's polite. The four of us finally met up after years of talking online. We finally met up for a Blake 7 convention this year and just had the most amazing time. So we've got some stuff coming up with the Peggy Mount boys. We've got loads more Exton Moss episodes coming along. We've plans to do more collaborations, and I think you're planning to come on one, aren't you?
I would love to come on.
Yeah.
Yes, we are going to do another one I've always wanted to finally seen, is They Came From Somewhere Else.
Absolutely. I get another one I remember watching at the time that it came out, because that was 84. I think I'd have been about 15.
I can't wait to talk about that one.
But we've got a number of collaborations coming up with other podcasters. We keep on drinking gin, so we keep on reviewing it in the Tonic Screwdriver, and we're about the only thing where we're in any way organised onto a regular monthly schedule is the Archive of Audio Antiquities, where we look at classic radio shows and audio drama. And we were also doing Kinky Boots, which was an episode by episode guide to watch through of the Avengers, but that's kind of stalled because we did a collaboration that took about 8 times as long as a normal episode, and Ken edits a bit of it and then kind of loses the will to live. It will be brilliant it will be absolutely brilliant when it comes out, but it's taking him forever.
I'm going to look forward to all your productions, and especially talking about They Came From Somewhere Else.
Yes, we need to sort a recording date out for that.
Cool. Well, it just remains for me to say thank you very much, both of you, Simon and Mark, for spending so much time. And it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation.
Simon, sorry, Simon. Just like to say before leaving, just to get the opportunity, it's been an absolute delight this evening to talk with you and share with you ideas about this fantastic show. It's been absolutely lovely. Gareth, it's been fantastic. Thank you very much for having me on this show.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, and you had nothing to worry about. You've been excellent, absolutely excellent.
I am absolutely going to echo the love in, because this has been fantastic, and even better than having a geeky sci-fi or geeky weird TV program that you love. Even better than that is finding somebody else who not only loves it as well, but actually has some of the same headcanon, because our ideas about them being universal antibodies are coming from different branches of science, but they pretty much met in the middle.
Yeah, brilliant. Good. Yes, it's been great.
This has been fantastic. It was wonderful meeting you, and you should come onto the Exton Moss experiment as well.
Oh yeah, so I'll probably get in touch. I'll probably get in touch, Simon, with you.
Have a listen to a couple before you agree to it.
Okay. I'll be in touch with you.
We're a touch more chaotic.
Okay, no worries. No worries.
Okay, well, thank you much. I shall let you both return to your places in space and time.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your evening. And thank you very much. Take care.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Sapphire and Steel was released on VHS by ITC starting in 1994. It was then released in 2 DVD sets in 2002, followed by a single complete set by Network in 2007. At the time of recording, it is available to stream on ITVX. Big Finish produced 3 seasons of audio dramas, beginning in 2005, in which Susanna Harker and David Warner took on the title roles. Very British Futures is hosted and produced by Gareth Preston, with guests Simon Exton and Mark Stalker. Music by Chattery Art. If you can take a moment to rate us on your podcast app, that would be much appreciated. You can get in touch with the podcast via verybritishfuturespodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on X @FuturesVery, or visit our Facebook page. This has been a Phantom Frame production.